there are hundreds, I mean, maybe thousands of George Washington scholars in the world, who've been they made life studying George Washington, and incredible fans of, I mean, certainly millions of incredible fans. And, here I am, maybe I'm the punkish guy coming along trashing him.
This is A New Angle, and I'm your host, Justin Angle, marketing professor at the University of Montana College of Business. This podcast is my chance to speak with cool people doing awesome things in and around the great state of Montana. We are proudly underwritten by First Security Bank and Blackfoot. Hey folks, welcome back and thanks for tuning in. Today's episode features yet another incredible best-selling author who lives right here in Missoula, Montana, Peter Stark. We talk about Peter's adventure writing. That was my first touch point with his work, and At the Mercy of the River was a very important read for me. We also talk about his best-selling Astoria and his latest book, Young Washington. That book tells the story of an exceptionally formative period in Washington's life and confronts much of the mythology around this revered founding father. I've learned a lot reading Peter's books, and I've enjoyed them thoroughly. And I'm excited for you to learn more about his writing right now. Okay, so I'm here today with Peter Stark. Peter, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Oh yeah, delighted to be here.
That's
separated by a few miles.
Indeed. It's funny, like that's been my shtick with a podcast is saying, so I'm here today with such and so. And, for the last couple months, it's been quite untrue. We're not here today together, but yeah, we're a couple miles apart here in Missoula. So
you're upstream on Rattlesnake Creek and I'm downstream. So we've got this rushing band of water connecting us.
That's right. I could probably put a question in a bottle and it would probably be to you within, a couple of minutes. And
it would be really fast.
It's pumping right now. Well, excited to talk to you, Peter. I've been a fan of your work for a long time. As we were saying before we started recording, I read Astoria kind of right when it came out. I'd read your work in Outside Magazine in particular. And then a mutual friend, Dean McGovern. Dean is a guy I run with occasionally. And, I am a little younger than you, Peter, but kind of getting to the stage where the older I get, the better I was at endurance sports. And Dean recommended At the Mercy of the River. And I read that and it really kind of resonated with me. Some of the themes of maturing and your sort of relationship to adventure as you mature. So that book really resonated with me, and I appreciate the kind of raw honesty in that book. That was an adventure quite a few years ago. When was that? Run Down the River?
2002, and as you say, it was I was 48 then, and that was really one of those pivotal times in my life when I realized, well, I can't do the things that I used to be able to do. And I don't want to do some of the things I used to do.
Yeah. Talk about that process a little bit. I mean, cause you sort of, it seemed like early in your career, you were writing a lot about adventures that involved yourself, adventures you were doing.
Yeah, so that was really when I started off as a magazine writer a long time ago, in 1983. I started writing right away about adventurous things. And, I'd grown up in that tradition, really adventurous family. I, did a lot of canoe trips and traveling and, outdoors things, this and that. And so when I started writing for magazines, I started writing first-person adventures. And the first big article I wrote was for Outside Magazine when I went up to the Upper Peninsula of Michigan and hung out with the old Norwegian ski jumpers and learned how to ski jump, the old way. This is, way before all this sort of aerial skiing.
Indeed.
And I joke that I say to get a story and outside, I had to launch myself off of a ski jump head first, which is basically true.
Indeed.
So that story started a whole series of stories that I did mostly for Outside, but other magazines too, Smithsonian and some others, where I would undertake, some kind of adventure, and sometimes with an historical angle, sometimes not, and write about it in the first person. And so another kind of crazy example is a story I wrote for Outside, where has very much a Missoula connection. We were living above what was then Goldsmith's Ice Cream, right on the Clark Fork River.
Okay.
And I started thinking about the far north. And then I started wondering, like, wow, if you drove north on Highway 93 and you kept going, and then you kept going farther, and you kept going until you couldn't go any farther than that, where would you end up? And that evolved into this story called Driving to Greenland. And it was basically, we got in my father-in-law's VW van and drove 5 or 6 days north from Missoula, and then ended up in Yellowknife in the Northwest Territories, and then hopped smaller planes across the Arctic and ended up on Baffin Island. And then we kind of hitchhiked with this very small plane that was being hired by somebody else to take us all the way up to Ellesmere Island, which is big traditional jumping off point for expeditions to the North Pole, way high up there. And then we hired this little plane to take us the final hop over to northern Greenland, the farthest north villages in the world, which are, because the whole globe kind of converges up there. It's, this is only about a 200-mile flight from the Canadian Ellesmere Island.
Okay.
And, had a big adventure landing, and the landing gear snapped off, and
oh my gosh,
spinning down this tundra runway. And we ended up spending a month up there. Really fascinating, with hunters, Inuit hunters, who still hunted in traditional ways. And so we were going out on the sea ice in dog sleds and in boats, and they were hunting narwhals with harpoons, and it was a crazy experience. So that was a sort of first person adventure that I became engaged in, and I did that for quite a few years. And then in early 2002, I got a call from Outside Magazine saying, well, there's this kayak expedition going down an unexplored river in Africa, an unpaddled river, or one that no Westerners have paddled from source to mouth, and called the Lugenda River in northern Mozambique. And they said, well, do you want to go on this and be the writer? And I really hesitated about that, because by that time I was 48 years old, and Amy, my wife, Amy Ragsdale, who some of your listeners probably know, was the head of the dance program at the University of Montana for many years, a professor of dance. And she was working full-time at the university teaching, and we had 2 young children at home. And I'm going off on this African adventure down this river that nobody could seem to tell me how dangerous it might be.
Right.
And I was really hesitant about doing it. But Amy, who's more adventurous than I am, is a harder core traveler than I am, and has a way of kind of launching us into some of these adventures, these travel adventures. As I hesitated, she said, I really think you should do this African river trip, but if you get killed, I'm going to be really angry.
Exactly.
So that was sort of the framework in which I went on this incredible expedition that ended up in the book that you were referring to, At the Mercy of the River.
And with a cast of characters you had never had any interaction with before, right?
Right. And it was a wild crew and a little tiny expedition. It was organized by a woman who's based out of Colorado, who runs expeditions to Africa, safaris to Africa, named Sherry Briggs, and has a company called Explore. And she was one who organized it. And then her brother came along, and then we had a kayaking guide, white African. He was Rhodesian by birth, what's now Zimbabwe, but he'd been a kayak guide on the Zambezi River, through those big rapids. So he really knew what he was doing. And then we had another guy, a South African guy who was a former South African military, member of some kind of special forces operation, again, a white African. And he'd done the night jumps out of airplanes and over oceans and all that sort of thing. And so he was kind of like the security guide on this expedition, and that no one really knew what was down this river. Sherry had managed to fly over part of it, but it was, the tree canopy is so dense, it's just hard to see what's down there. And so we were in sea kayaks, which are, not really all that suited for whitewater rivers. And Sherry had the impression that there were some rapids, but not many. And I think I had some kayak experience. Clinton had a lot, and the other three had very little. So we started going down this river, and it's, everything you can imagine wild wilderness river in Africa is, just there are the crocs launching off the banks into the water. They're hippos, which are the African guys are really scared of hippos, like our guides, and so are the villagers, because the males are so territorial that they can just crush boats between those huge teeth. And so the hippos, the crocs, elephants on the bank. And in the beginning, every once in a while, we'd come to a little village. And then after a while, there were no villages. And then the river started dropping over these rock ledges. And, the first day we were kind of able to pull our boats over them. And, the second day they started getting worse. And, by about the third day in, it was really getting hairy. And I went over at least once in those early days, maybe twice. And, there you are, you're swimming with the crocs in this river. And then as we went along, we'd come around a bend. And at one point we came around a bend, and the lead guide, Clinton, I was in a tandem with Sherry's brother, Steve, the second kayak back, and Clinton was ahead. And we came racing around a bend in the river, which is overhung with trees. It's not wide, and the river braids in a lot of places. And Clinton's standing there on a boulder yelling, "Stop,
stop
right here." And so, the current was swift, but, we managed to stop on this boulder where he was. And you look over the edge of the boulder, and there's this big waterfall dropping away. And that was the situation was kind of emblematic of what that felt like, at least for me, going down that river.
Sure.
That the unknown was just around every bend, and it was really disconcerting. And I was, as I say, I was, in my late 40s and had kids at home, and thinking, okay, when am I getting myself, or we, getting into a really stupid situation? And at one point, I think you've read the book, but at one point I really balked, and I didn't think I could go on because it was just too dangerous. And then I thought, well, what's the alternative? There isn't one. What am I going to do? Walk through the forest for the next 6 days? So had to keep going, but it was one of those really kind of an epiphany about how I'd reached as far as I wanted to go in the adventurous life. This was going to be the apex, and from here I was taking up kind of a safer approach
Sure.
to writing and to life. And I say I joke sometimes that I used to do all this crazy stuff and write about it. And then after a while, I realized I could get killed doing that stuff. And so now I write about other people doing the crazy stuff. And so I'm writing about historical adventures is what I'm writing about now. But that river trip was a pivotal moment for me.
Yeah, and that came through. So kind of you couldn't tell what was next in terms of your writing career at the time, but in terms of just your sensibility in reporting that experience, it certainly resonated with me, and it's been interesting to kind of see how your work has unfolded since, with Astoria and now Young Washington. I want to talk about both of those projects, but before we do, just generally, like what, in terms of, writing a story about or reporting on a story about adventure, like what are the qualities of an adventure that you think interest you? Like what are the hooks for you that draw you in and make you think that this is a project I want to dig into?
There's something that really compels me, and at least it did. In fact, I was sort of driven by it. And that was, I was really interested in seeing how indigenous people live in these very different environments. We spent our honeymoon hiking around on the Tibetan plateau with Tibetan nomads, and we spent that time with Inuit hunters in northern Greenland, and this Africa river trip, the same thing. That really being in touch with these people who have a whole different way of life, a whole different perspective on life. And I wanted to be exposed to that. I wanted to see it. I wanted to understand it. And I also had this, almost burning anxiety that the world was becoming so interconnected so quickly that if I wanted to experience those things, those people, if I wanted to visit people like that, cultures like that, I had to do it now, because they might not be around much longer in their very traditional way of life. And so that was what I considered made a good adventure for me, was to be able to learn something about these cultures firsthand.
Sure.
And I did, and I'm really grateful I did that. It was, it was not easy to get there, and there were a lot of difficulties about it. And one of them being, of course, income, when you're doing this kind of thing. So fortunately, Amy had her teaching job at the U, which kind of, kept us above water. But, my writing career at that point was very much up and down. And yet I was driven by this, kind of compulsion to get out to these very, what we'd say, remote societies.
And so would you say that, Astoria was kind of a breakthrough publication for you? Is that your first book that really took off, New York Times bestseller, and got into the mainstream conversation?
Yes, that one did, certainly more than any other before. I had in the year 2001, I came out with a book called Last Breath, which was, there's a long backstory to that, but it's stories about fictitious adventurers, whom I invented, but then I put them into these really desperate situations and trace the science, the actual science of their physiology and to some degree psychology, in these situations, hypothermia, heat stroke, falling, all sorts of malaria. And so it's sort of a mix of science and adventure. And that resonated with some people. That did quite well. And I don't know, it's translated into, I think, 7 or 8 languages. So it had a good presence abroad. But I think the difference was that when I wrote Astoria, which came out in 2014, that here was a case where I really threw myself into the history of it, and into the history. And in some of my earlier books, like At the Mercy of the River, I tried to weave in history.
Sure. Yeah.
The history of African exploration, which I really enjoyed doing. And at one point, my agent said, you write really well about history. Maybe you should try writing some history.
Right.
And so I came across this story. I stumbled upon it about the Astorians. And, I'd really grown up steeped in the stories of Lewis and Clark as we are here in Montana. And I grew up in the Midwest, in Wisconsin, where there's the fur trade was so elemental to the beginnings of the settlement of that area. But I'd never really heard about this expedition sent by John Jacob Astor. And yet it was just the craziest expedition. So many things going wrong. And, it's like where everything went right for Lewis and Clark, everything went wrong for these guys. And out of 140 of the participants, roughly half, 70 or so, died in various violent ways. And you compare that to Lewis and Clark, who are always held up as sort of the paragon of success and safety. And I think they lost one guy to I think Sergeant Floyd to appendicitis,
right,
out of roughly 30. And so here's this crazy story, and I might have actually heard of it from my father, who is deeply into local history and the fur trade and voyageurs. And so I'm sure he'd mentioned Astor to me in connection with the fur trade, but I never really thought anything of it until I came across this story years later. And it really touched a note with me. It really resonated with me, these guys struggling in the wilderness. And I realized that was something that has intrigued me all along, is to see how humans respond to these extreme situations in the wilderness. What are the emotional dynamics, and also just the physical survival skills that come out in these situations. And so that story it really felt like it was really in my line. I felt once I started writing it, I felt like I was just kind of rocking and rolling, because sure. I could bring my own wilderness experiences to bear on what these guys were undergoing, including paddling down an unknown river in quite similar circumstances. There was a much bigger expedition with a much greater disaster looming at the end. But, I had a real sense of what it's like to be out in these places. And so I think if there's one thing that might distinguish my writing from other writing about history, is that I really try to bring that vividness to the story I'm telling, that what it feels like to be in some of these situations. And because you hear these stories about, George Washington, he was a young surveyor, and then he was in the French and Indian War, and it's all kind of abstract. And, but this guy spent like 5 years in the wilderness, almost in and out of the wilderness, and had all sorts of crazy adventures and misadventures, and almost died falling off a raft into a frozen river, and all sorts of crazy things. And so I really went at that with kind of a fine-tooth comb to do the research for this Young Washington book, to find every little teeny detail I could, everything that he wrote at that time, and everything, written not so much about him, but about this the situation, French and Indian War in the wilderness, and using that, I tried to bring out the vividness of young George going through these experiences and also the struggles he was having, and he had a lot of struggles.
A New Angle is brought to you by First Security Bank and Blackfoot, two cool companies doing awesome things all over Montana.
I'm Maureen Dowd of the New York Times, and you're listening to A New Angle.
Yeah, let's talk about some of those struggles. I mean, in the sense that, like probably many people that sort of, have a high school level conception of history, it's like, this kid cut down the cherry tree, then he crossed the Delaware, and then, he was the first president and the man that would be king and stepped aside nobly, but not much in between. And so you zero in on this 5-year period of his young life, and it's so illuminating. I mean, and that must have been what drew you in, is to sort of see this character that we have a big, well, not necessarily a mythology around, but a lot of.
Well, yeah, I'd say yes, there is a mythology around him, and some of it deserved, and some of it, myth. But that was part of exactly what interested me was, here was this real guy, a 22-year-old who inadvertently sets off the French and Indian War by ambushing a French diplomatic party out in the woods, and a guy who's so thin-skinned and really whiny at the beginning, and he's always feeling like he's being dissed. He's always feeling like he's not getting what he actually deserves. He's constantly complaining to his superior about money, about promotion, about this and that, until his superior British Governor Dinwiddie of Virginia, you can almost literally see him roll his eyes between the lines of the letters he writes. It was like, George, I really don't want to hear from you anymore.
Right. Just get it
like
done.
Go back to your post. And yet here was this guy who had, all these human foibles that way all of us have human foibles, and who made lots of mistakes the way all of us make lots of mistakes. And yet he somehow got beyond that, and he became this incredible leader, which is, he was an incredible leader, and he, was managed to lead in that selfless way. It was never without an ego, but that very much thinking for the greater good. And it's such a radical departure from, or change from, what he was thinking at as a 22-year-old. It wasn't the greater good. It was so much about George. And so that transformation really fascinated me. And I also was really fascinated by the way wilderness and war had played a part in that transformation of George, from this really self-centered guy to this, great selfless leader. And I reflect on that somewhat in the book, and about in wilderness, you're put in these extreme situations, which he was, and that, the whole social hierarchy that he grew up with in Virginia, they're known to be, at that era in the mid 1700s, 8 different classes of people in Virginia.
Wow.
But you get out in the wilderness, and in a difficult, extreme situation, really none of that matters.
Yeah, there's one class of people, essentially, or maybe 2, survivors and non. Yeah,
right, exactly. And so I was really interested in the transformative aspect of the wilderness for young George, and likewise that, the warfare part. He fought in the French and Indian War at this period in his early 20s, and had a good hand in setting the spark that made it explode in the first place. And how there are, at least in my mind, some really key moments, these sort of transformative moments, where the first really big and it's not such a big battle, but really disastrous battle, other than the ambush of the French diplomatic party, is when the French come after George, and the French have their Indian allies, and George is holed up in a little fort called Fort Necessity, and has a few hundred of his Virginia soldiers with him. And he's, this young officer, and he's built this fort. It's this really little claptrap affair, and he's built it kind of down in a swamp, and he's built it so, as it turns out, the French and the Indians can hide behind trees on a hill just above the fort and shoot right down in it. And he's planning on attacking them with his men all lined up in formation, and they can't even see the Indians to attack because they're all hiding. And so nothing works and nothing goes well, and it starts pouring rain, and it ends up being this just terrible situation where they're in these mud-filled trenches, and there are these descriptions, these firsthand descriptions. These trenches are full of mud and blood, and everybody's, their bodies strewn around, and and they're clearly going to lose this battle. And I think George had to have gone through this transformation in a way, or at least started it right there. And looking at the faces of these young soldiers who are, lying dead in the muddy, bloody trenches, and in the rain as darkness is falling, and realizing that he was really the one who led them into this situation. And he was really very much responsible for this situation. And so in that moment and other moments like those, I see George's sense of himself, that self-centeredness beginning to spread out, wider fashion, to become more empathetic to others around him. And first starting with his men and fellow officers, and then going out from there, he eventually becomes responsible for protecting the frontier settlers of Virginia from attack from the French and the Indian allies. And it's a really difficult task, impossible to defend these frontier settlers, and yet they're pleading with him, they're begging him to help them. And that just can't help but to develop his spreading sense of empathy. And he writes a letter at that time, actually, that it's almost hysterical, not funny, but emotionally wrought, about how he'd give his own life if he could to save these people, but he can't. Nothing can be done. And so over the years, these 5 years when he's in wilderness and war, I really sense his sense of self and sense of empathy moving from being totally focused on George to being focused on a much broader circle of people around him.
Sure.
And eventually he takes that a long way in 20 years later, really.
Yeah, absolutely. So he's emerging as a leader, as somebody who sort of is thinking about more than just himself and his own agenda. Within that, how were his feelings about the British Empire emerging, and how did, in the period you studied, did you see seeds for how he would become such a leader in the revolutionary effort?
Oh, yeah, very much so. And until you really read the details of that era of his life, you don't realize how badly he wanted to be an officer in the British Royal Army.
I mean, there did seem like there was a little chip on the shoulder, growing up.
Yeah, more than a little.
Yeah, exactly.
But that he went to great lengths to make his case to British higher ups. At one point, he rode 1,000-mile round trip journey, leaving his post in the Virginia wilderness to ride up to Boston to petition the British general there to, give him a commission in the Royal Army. he was a soldier, an officer in the Virginia colonial military, and it was a much lesser rank, had much less prestige than a Royal Army officer. And so he spent several years trying to become a British Royal Army officer. And from a very early age, there are letters, a young age. I think the first one I think is at 22, when he writes again to Governor Dinwiddie, saying, we Americans are being treated as second class to the British, to the British soldiers, and really complaining about that, and about the food allotment and the pay, and on and on and on. And so he carries that resentment with him. I mean, he really wants to be a British Royal Army officer, and he never makes it. And yet he goes back to, after the French and Indian War, he goes back at age 27 or so to Virginia Plantation Society, and he marries Martha, who's the richest widow in Virginia. And so now he's really has kind of risen to the top of Virginia society. And he aspires in a way to a British lifestyle, the way all or most of the Virginia plantation owners did. That, it was really kind of a British country gentleman lifestyle, and an expensive one to maintain, of course. And it was maintained by many, many, many slaves, and indentured servants, and, all sorts of what are human cruelties. So he's aspiring to that lifestyle. But then once the colonies start, rebelling, he's one of the first to really jump on, saying, if we have to, we'll take up arms against these guys.
Okay.
And so he made his resentment against the British, I don't think, caused him to just randomly rebel against the British, but it was part of the emotional baggage he carried going into the revolution. And a lot of the Americans and the Virginia planters, they had their own emotional baggage about, taxation and whatnot. So, but yeah, he was very much a product of this period of his life, and resentment and disappointment at not being made a British Royal Army officer was very much a part of it.
Indeed. The book, Peter, is fantastic. Young Washington, How Wilderness and War Forged America's Founding Father. So good, in fact, that your work was sort of wrapped into or picked up by this larger History Channel documentary, Washington. It was out, I believe it aired in February of this past year. I want to talk about that experience. I mean, working with Doris Kearns Goodwin, sort of the George Washington of presidential historians, if you will. But yeah, talk about that experience.
Yeah, it was really great fun. I mean, it's a 3-part miniseries, and it's each part is 2 hours about the life of George Washington. Mm-hmm. And the first 2 hours, focus on when he's younger. I think it might go up to the time the revolution starts, but certainly this period, which I write about, and I write about it in great detail. And so the producers of the History Channel series, an outfit called Rail Splitter Productions, got a hold of me, I guess it was just about a year ago, and said they were putting this thing together, and Doris Kearns Goodwin was likely to be involved, and would you want to be involved? And I said, oh yeah, I'd love to.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I do feel like this period of George's life, I feel I can speak to that, if I do say so, as well as almost anybody, because I just spent 4 years working on studying it, mm-hmm. writing about it. So, I have a lot to say about it. And so they flew me out to New York. I think it was maybe last March. And we spent, I don't know, some hours. It was just one long day shoot in this nice townhouse doing the shoot. And they'd really done their homework, and they, asked good questions. And, there were clearly very professional, several cameras going, and sound people, and moving cameras, and on and on. And then and then that's the last I really had anything to do with it until February. And for the producers, it was a huge project, and they interviewed so many people, and they went and they shot the thing in 17 days in Romania.
Oh my
And
gosh.
all these wilderness scenes in Romania. So and crossing the Delaware, scenes like that, and recreating winter in Romania. And so then in early February, I got a call one day, and I was hearing that it might be airing pretty soon, but I got a call one day, and it was one of those calls where it's just sort of blank on the other end of the line. And the first thing I think of is, oh, it's just another mortgage refinance call.
Right.
and, and and they say, is this Peter? And I said, oh, now the mortgage people know my first name. Yeah. And then I said, who's this? This is Doris.
Oh my gosh.
and so we had a great chat, and her business partner, Beth Lasky, was on the line too. And they invited me to come out to Mount Vernon for the premiere of this History Channel series, which was, it was only like 10 days away, the premiere. And so I did, and I've got some crazy stories about that, including riding a bike through the rain and dark from Reagan National Airport down the Potomac to Mount Vernon.
Oh my gosh.
That's for another day. With just like George riding his horse. But it was a cool event. And some of the other historians were there, and Doris was there, and Beth, and and a lot of the producers, and from Rail Splitter and from the History Channel, and a big auditorium. It was all by invitation and special guests, and they closed Mount Vernon, the whole place, including the mansion, the house, to give our group private tours through. And so it was really a kind of VIP treatment. And of course, what part do they show? They show part one, and that was the screening, that was the premiere event.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was pretty cool. There I was, like, all of a sudden I'm up on the big screen, and at this premiere, and it was great. And I also got I've gotten to know Doris and Beth from that experience, and we've been in touch somewhat since. But they're great fun. I mean, Doris is just a kick, and really fun, really smart, so together, and has 1,000 projects in the works. So that whole experience was delightful.
So within this crew, or maybe outside the crew, when you've been sort of promoting this work, I mean, you study this 5-year slice of this fellow's life, George Washington, when, I think, for lack of a more elegant term, you could say it was a little punkish. And so
whatever the word was back then.
Yeah. So at odds with, what he later became and what the sort of popular conception is. You ever get any pushback from folks that are like, hey, don't say that about George Washington. That can't be true.
I was so braced for that. That's a really good question. I was so braced for that. And, there are hundreds, maybe thousands of George Washington scholars in the world, who've been, they've made their life studying George Washington, and incredible fans of, certainly millions of incredible fans of George Washington. And, here I am, maybe I'm the punkish guy coming along, trashing him in this book. And so I was apprehensive about that, and I was really braced for it. But on the other hand, I really did my research. I nailed down everything very carefully. It's all documented and cited and whatnot. And I tried to be both fair and tough on George, and acknowledge that he was a great leader. He became a great leader, no doubt about it. And he was absolutely fearless in battle. And so the first time I really put this out into that arena of the experts and the big fans was this is almost a year and a half ago, I was invited to Mount Vernon for the first time. This is before the History Channel thing, to give a book talk on my book. And, and so there I am standing in front of an auditorium of, I don't know, at least 200 people who are at Mount Vernon, House of George. And, I thought I was just like, I'm speaking blasphemy about this guy in his own house. And so I gave my presentation, which is, it goes through a lot of his foibles and some of the transformation we're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And then the question and answer period came. And so, I was ready to duck and cover right there. And, but no, not a single, what you'd call hostile question, or remark. And the same has been true in every presentation I've given, and I've given dozens upon dozens, including, the Army War College and on and on. But what it is people are really curious. They really want to know, like, what was this guy like? And they have questions. And so it's their curiosity that gets engaged about this period of his life. And it's not, I've never had anyone say that they were, offended, or I was tearing down or idle or anything like that, which was a complete surprise to me.
Yeah, that's so refreshing to hear. And you wonder what the dynamics are that sort of sets that apart. Because there are prominent figures in history that, we just simply kind of don't talk about big aspects of their life, whether it's Thomas Jefferson, fathering slave children, or Helen Keller kind of being a vociferous communist and so forth. Those parts of their history are certainly left out of the grade school versions. Do you think there's something different about Washington? Maybe it's the fact that it occurred when he was young and he grew out of those things that maybe set him apart?
Well, I think that's certainly a big factor in that. If he hadn't grown out of those things, he certainly wouldn't have been the great leader that he eventually became. And so, and I think I find it very, phenomenally admirable that he transformed in the way that he did, and became this person with an entirely different orientation, yet retained some of his skills, and he was always a competent guy in a lot of ways, and conscientious, and on. And that transformation, I think, stands as much as anything as an example of how great he was. And so some of these other leaders, do you see their if you want to call them weaknesses when they're in that position of leadership? Does that undermine them? There was, George as a leader didn't always make the right decisions either. Mm-hmm. But I think because his trajectory was so long, started really so low by comparison, and went so high over such a long period of time, you just can't help but say, wow, this guy was phenomenal.
Yeah. Well, certainly fascinating to learn more about him. Peter, I want to be respectful of your time on our, in our time together here, and I know this is a risky question to ask writers, but can you tell us a little bit about what you're working on now?
I can tell you. So I'm working on, until about an hour ago today, a book about the great Shawnee Indian leader Tecumseh.
Okay.
And about William Henry Harrison, who was in a way his opponent, antagonist. Mm-hmm. And Tecumseh was trying to unify tribes across the center of the continent to stand as one and not give any of their lands over to the federal government, the white government, unless all tribes agreed to it. Because of course that was the way the federal government got so much of the land, was they were playing one tribe off against the other, or having one tribe sell somebody else's land, and things like that. And so Tecumseh put together this coalition to stop that. And he was again one of these incredible leaders who's in his era, he was so widely acknowledged as being this incredible leader. And William Henry Harrison was the came from Washington's background in a lot of ways, that he was the heir to a Virginia tobacco plantation, and the soil had sort of become exhausted, and the family was sort of out of money, and then the father died, and young William Henry, his sixth generation heir, bailed out on the plantation life and went over the mountains into the Ohio Valley and became an Indian fighter. And so he and Tecumseh literally went toe to toe, and in some cases they met in person on the front grounds of the governor's mansion out in the woods of what's now Indiana, to try to work things out. And they had tremendous respect for each other as leaders, but they both embodied a completely different vision, a completely different way of life, and a vision of a life, and a vision of land ownership, and a vision of acquisition. So that's what I'm working on.
Yeah, sounds fantastic. What's the timeline, or when can we expect?
Well, that's the risky question.
Yeah, I suppose it is. Yeah. But you always have a deadline.
I don't know. I'm a little past halfway done with it, but, closing in on the 2/3 mark.
Is that kind of like a marathon, that you're not halfway done until you get to mile 20?
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Yeah, and then of course, then you always want to go back and rerun the first half of the marathon.
Exactly. Yeah, probably a little slower.
To make it better. So yeah, it's due this fall, and I hope to get it in then. So I'm it's going along well, but it's, again, it's this research is very time consuming in these cases.
Indeed.
And and especially when you're trying to find information about an Indian leader in 1795 and 1805, that that there were just not written records left by the Shawnee, but there were records left by letters by settlers and things like that. So
Sure.
it's a lot of poking around.
Well, I certainly look forward to seeing that work when it comes out. Peter, it's such a pleasure to hear about all of your projects. I encourage people to check out Young Washington, check out Astoria. If you're sort of an aging athlete like me, check out At the Mercy, because that really spoke to me. Yeah, and Peter, I look forward to maybe an opportunity to meet in person, and we can talk about the Tecumseh project then, perhaps.
Yeah, that'd be great. Yeah, I'd love to get together in person. And it's been a fun interview and covered a lot of ground.
Well, thank you, and we'll be in touch. Thanks for listening to A New Angle. We really appreciate it. And we're coming to you from Studio 49, a gift from University of Montana alums Michelle and Lauren Hansen. And remember that A New Angle is supported by CED, Consolidated Electrical Distributors. These guys pretty much sell anything electrical you would ever need, but they also hire a ton of our students. If you want to learn more about jobs at CED, visit cedcareers.com. Before we go, I want to thank some important peeps. Our awesome interns, Aspen Runkle and Max Gibson, Jeff Ament, John Wicks, and VTO for the tunes, and finally, props to Jeff Meese, our master of all things sound. Finally, if you have any questions, suggestions, comments, insults, whatever, please email me at anewangle@umontana.edu. Help us spread the word, and be sure to use the hashtag #anewangle when you do. Thanks a lot, and see you next time.